Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. These were the men who would bring an end to the brutal civil wars. They would go down in history as the unifiers.
There's a story in Japanese that explains the character of the three unifiers. And Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu are watching a cuckoo bird waiting for it to sing, but the bird doesn't sing. And Nobunaga says, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I will kill you." And Hideyoshi says, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I'll make you sing." And Ieyasu says, "Little bird, if you don't sing, I'll wait for you to sing." And Ieyasu is a patient strategist who will wait for things to go his way, and then he'll act.
After Nobunaga's death, Ieyasu and Hideyoshi faced off in a measured game of strategy, each in his own way trying to outsmart the other.
武人としてのリーダーとすれば、まず自ら先頭に立って。
As a military leader, Ieyasu was a courageous man who never hesitated in battle. However, though he was brave, he was also cautious. One famous story, Ieyasu was known as an excellent horseman. One day he and his troops had to cross a very narrow bridge over a raging river. Everyone was watching to see how the great Ieyasu would ride his horse over this dangerous bridge. To his men's surprise, Ieyasu dismounted, took the horse's reins in his hands, and carefully led the horse over the bridge to the other side of the river. That's how vigilant he was. I believe this kind of caution helped him to be victorious in battle.
While Ieyasu practiced restraint and careful strategizing, Hideyoshi acted quickly and decisively. Hideyoshi was from peasant stock. The son of a lowly foot soldier, he worked his way up through the ranks. Hideyoshi became known as a brilliant general, and he held the same grand vision of himself.
When my mother conceived me, she was given a miraculous omen. On the very night that I was born, the room was suddenly aglow with sunlight, thus changing night to day. Finally, they divined, the child whose birth was attended by these miracles was destined to become a man of unusual attainments. This prediction is fulfilled in me.
Shortly after Hideyoshi took control, Ieyasu challenged him. But Ieyasu soon realized there was more to be gained as Hideyoshi's ally than as his enemy. Hideyoshi rewarded Ieyasu for his loyalty with a vast domain of land and ordered him to make his headquarters in the remote fishing village of Edo, 300 miles east of Hideyoshi's castle in Osaka. Some might have thought the gift an insult. But in Edo, the village that would later become Tokyo, Ieyasu busied his troops building a massive 5-story castle fortification. Within the walls of the city of Osaka, Hideyoshi was consumed with fortifying his own castle. Reputed to be the most impregnable fortress of its time, it was also one of the most ostentatious. Osaka Castle had a strategic location, close to the emperor's palace in nearby Kyoto. For centuries, the emperor had remained a ruler in name only, ignored by those who truly held power. He whiled away his days with court gossip, calligraphy, and poetry.
By Ieyasu's time, the court is still powerless, but it is only the court which can appoint the shogun. So, in the ultimate symbolic sense, the court is still the arbiter of final resort. That's why all the warlords are aiming for Kyoto. You have to get the emperor to recognize that you're the most powerful of all of the combatants on the field of battle.
Hideyoshi curried the emperor's favor, inviting him to no plays and musical performances. But the emperor would not grant this warrior of peasant stock the title of shogun. Ieyasu never relinquished his desire for power. He offered the emperor more than invitations. He arranged the marriage of one of his granddaughters to the emperor's son.
All of the lords in Japan used family to cement political alliances. You would marry off daughters or marry off sons. What Ieyasu did in particular was have an abundance of sons that he could use. He could set them up to support his nascent government. He could set them up as independent military lords that he could then call upon for help.
In contrast, Ieyasu's rival Hideyoshi failed to produce a male heir. Finally, he adopted a nephew and groomed him as his successor. Then, at 60 years of age, Hideyoshi finally fathered a son of his own. He called him Hideyori, and he was the jewel of his life. Hideyoshi's thoughts now turned to the safety and survival of his young son.
I cannot describe the endless tedium, as if I were guarding an empty house when Hideyori is not here with me. I say again, strictly order that all be vigilant against fire. Each night have someone make the rounds of the rooms 2 or 3 times.
As Hideyoshi obsessed over his own son, his adopted son, now an adult, was in peril.
It's clear that by the end of his life, Hideyoshi was acting more and more erratically. He became increasingly cruel, if not sadistic. Then when he finally, in his final years, produced an heir of his own, he ordered this adult male who had been his heir to commit suicide.
Hideyoshi then ordered his adopted son's entire family put to death. A missionary recounted.
They were drawn along the streets in the carts to the open view of the world. 31 ladies and gentlewomen, with the 2 sons and 1 daughter of his adopted son, the oldest of whom was not more than 5 years old. All their bodies were thrown into a pit, over which was built a little chapel with a tomb in it, with this inscription: "The tomb of the traitors."
Soon after, Hideyoshi's health began to fail. He wrote his death poem.
As the dew I fall, as the dew I vanish. Even Osaka Fortress is a dream within a dream.
Hideyoshi then called Ieyasu and 4 of the most powerful daimyo to his deathbed. He appointed them legal protectors of his 5-year-old son Hideyori, his heir and the future ruler of Japan. Ieyasu pledged to protect the boy with his own life, a pledge that would become very difficult to keep.
It is said that war is a curse. It is resorted to only when it is inevitable. However, in time of peace, do not forget the possibility of disturbances.
Ieyasu was on guard. Those daimyo who feared his growing power began to plot against him. Ieyasu's territory now extended throughout most of Japan. He was determined to maintain his holdings and expand his base of power.
One of Ieyasu's nicknames is the Old Badger, and it reflects his craftiness as well as his famed ability to wait. And he waits until after Hideyoshi is dead, until he has a clear preponderance of power, and then makes his move to become the dominant military leader in Japan.
Ieyasu mobilized his troops. He sent one division to Ogaki Castle, where his enemies were gathering. When the battle began, women and children rushed to safety.
Ieyasu sent a large force to lay siege to the castle, and they fought day and night.
One of the young girls at the castle later told her family of the terrifying experience.
Mothers, concubines, and daughters all stayed in the tower and cast bullets. There was panic. A bullet struck my younger brother, killing him on the spot. It was a cruel sight. Indeed, it was. We felt as if we should die. There was nothing but fear and horror left.
As the battle wore on, heads of slain warriors were brought to the castle to be prepared for the ritual presentation to the victor. It was believed that even in death, the samurai should be viewed as a worthy opponent.
Those people who were in the castle would wash the heads, and they would put some cosmetics on the face of the dead corpses because they were proof of having killed someone important. That was part of the very small part of what they did, which is inconceivable to, us modern people, modern women.
All the decapitated heads were brought into the tower. We weren't a bit afraid of the heads and used to sleep in the midst of the nasty smell of bloody heads.
Victorious at Ogaki Castle, Ieyasu's troops now pursued the rebellious daimyo and their armies. They faced off in a narrow valley just west of the village of Sekigahara. This would be the battle that changed the course of Japanese history. Ieyasu set up his command post atop a hill overlooking the valley, waiting through the night for the rest of his armies to arrive. At dawn, Ieyasu's attendant physician hastily noted in his journal,
"Slight rain, dense fog in the mountain valley. Can't see. Barely made out enemy banners. On horseback, Lord Ieyasu made out their positions. Estimate distance at 2.5 miles.
Ieyasu was outnumbered, with only 50,000 troops challenging his enemy's 80,000. He waited for his son to arrive with reinforcements. But at 8 in the morning, the fog suddenly lifted, and the two opposing armies found themselves within striking distance. Ieyasu could wait no more. Rallying his troops, it was said he sent them forward with his famous battle cry.
There are only two ways to come back from the battlefield. With the head of an enemy, or without your own.
Ieyasu watched as his troops faced what seemed insurmountable odds. Then, suddenly, the tide turned. Several enemy daimyo and their armies, convinced of Ieyasu's ultimate victory, defected and joined Ieyasu's forces. By 2 p.m., Ieyasu's troops had defeated the rebellious army.
Tokugawa's victory at Sekigahara brought an end to the warring states and signaled the beginning of a new era. That's the significance of the Battle of Sekigahara.
In recognition of Ieyasu's power, the emperor awarded him the title of shogun, the barbarian subduing generalissimo. Tokugawa Ieyasu now had the authority to rule Japan in all military matters. He ruled unchallenged, but always there was the specter of Hideyoshi's young son Hideori growing up in Osaka Castle. Ieyasu had sworn with his life to protect the boy who could someday lay claim to all Ieyasu had won. As the young boy Hideori approached manhood, a daimyo warned,
Although he is Hideyoshi's heir, Ieyasu would never let him rule Japan. Sooner or later, some ambitious character will foment rebellion in his name. And even if Hideyori knows nothing about it, he will be blamed and forced to commit suicide to the grief of Hideyoshi's ghost.
Now, the Tokugawas had no divine right to rule Japan. They ruled Japan because they were the most powerful, they had the most money, they had the most soldiers, but they had no divine right. And there were many other powerful daimyo, especially in the West, the Christian daimyo. And so if there were any philosophy, any political movement that would bring these daimyo together as a coalition against the Tokugawa family, that was very dangerous.
Tokugawa Ieyasu tolerated no dissent. He expelled many of the foreign missionaries, including João Rodrigues.
Ieyasu wanted to clear the board of all these foreign influences which were just muddying the waters, making life more complicated.
He even ordered all Christian activity among the Japanese halted. But still he faced the only true threat to his power, the young Hideori.
By the time he reaches adulthood, Hideori can no longer be ignored by Ieyasu. He's a threat simply because he exists. He is the legitimate heir of Hideyoshi. Ieyasu is supposed to be supporting him until he becomes an adult, and he poses an intrinsic threat to the legitimacy of the Tokugawa shogunate.
Ieyasu came to but one conclusion. He could no longer honor his pledge to a dead ally to protect his son. Ieyasu decided to go into battle once more.
It was obviously going to be another showdown. And the many samurai, in their thousands, and these were hard-bitten warriors, they still owed loyalty to Hideyoshi's family. And of course they owed just as much loyalty to his son. So they gathered in Osaka Castle, and Osaka Castle was a very strong castle. It was considered impregnable.
In the winter of 1614, Ieyasu accused Hideori of subversion and ordered his troops to advance against Osaka Castle. Hideori's supporters, nearly 100,000, held strong. Ieyasu retaliated with a devious plan. He sent a woman samurai to negotiate a truce with Hideori's mother. Ieyasu offered a safe haven for Hideori's garrison if in return he agreed not to mount further rebellion against Ieyasu's rule. To prove his intentions, Ieyasu signed the pledge in blood. Hideori's mother convinced her son to accept the offer. Ieyasu's ploy had worked.
As soon as the fighting stopped, Ieyasu began to fill in the moats of Osaka Castle, the deep moats. And the people in the Osaka Castle protested a lot. That was not in the agreement. But that didn't matter. They filled in the moats. And once the moats were filled in, then Ieyasu's troops would storm into the castle, and there was a dreadful slaughter.
Thousands of defeated soldiers, women, and children fled the castle compound. A European merchant recorded the event in his journal.
We had news today that Ieyasu hath taken the fortress of Osaka and overthrown the forces of Hideyori. They say the taking of this fortress hath cost about 100,000 lives, and that no dead man of account is found with his head on, but all cut off.
Ieyasu's army set the castle on fire. As the flames raged around him, Hideyori refused to surrender and was left with no other option. He committed seppuku.
There's one big problem with killing Hideyori, however, and that's that Ieyasu was supposed to be his supporter. I mean, it's a very realistic, cold-blooded strategy, but he wanted to establish a dynasty that would last through the ages. There is reason to believe that Ieyasu genuinely regretted having to kill the son of his former lord. Ieyasu is said to have paid penance by writing the name of the Buddha 10,000 times on scrolls of parchment.
Tokugawa Ieyasu had wiped out the last threats to his power, or so it seemed. But not everyone was under his control. There were the Western traders who he valued but mistrusted, and the Christians who he considered a threat. Tokugawa Ieyasu had won the wars. His struggle to control the future of Japan had just begun. The shogun's iron hand extended to every detail of a peasant's life.
Farmers must work in the fields from dawn to dusk. Wives and daughters must make meals 3 times a day, put on red headbands, and take the meals to the fields. Once men are home after dusk, sisters-in-law and female cousins must put the chapped feet of the man on the stomach of his wife and massage them.
If the shogun's intolerable edicts weren't bad enough, the farmers were also heavily taxed. There were taxes on windows and shelves, a head tax on each newborn child, and a whole tax to bury the dead. The farmers were taxed in rice, the currency of the day. Ironically, farmers were not allowed to eat the rice they grew. These taxes were collected by the daimyo to finance their elaborate processions to Edo, and to pay the stipends which supported the samurai class. The farmers were in dire straits, as a Japanese writer lamented.
Year by year, the farmers grew more exhausted. How could they sustain life itself under those circumstances?
In the Shimabara Peninsula in the far south of Japan, drought and famine further depleted the meager harvest. Those who could not pay the taxes were punished severely. In mid-December 1637, a single event ignited the long smoldering fuse. The young daughter of a farmer who owed taxes was seized and tortured. Furious with grief, the father and his friends killed the local governor, and the whole village, samurai, peasants, and Christians, rose in revolt. Soon the whole area was in the hands of the rebels, nearly 40,000.
So what began as a social upheaval, a social revolt against the tremendously harsh taxation against the peasants, leaving the peasants almost starving, what began as that somehow developed into a Christian rebellion.
A European merchant reported on the rebellion.
A few days after the outbreak, the Christians joined the farmers. They cry out throughout the whole country that the time had now come to revenge the innocent blood of so many Christians and priests, and that they are prepared to die for their faith.
The rebels swarmed into an abandoned castle surrounded on three sides by the sea. Feeling protected, they brought in their wives and children and barricaded themselves inside.
This was very upsetting. The peasants, who were the lowest of the low, the poor people, they had no right to rebel. And not only had they rebelled and revolted, but they were doing darned well militarily. And so no wonder the shogun was worried about this, because this might set an example to other parts of the country that had become unsatisfied with the crushing taxes which the peasants were paying.
The shogun didn't tolerate dissidents, especially any who looked to Jesus for help. He sent his troops to Shimabara to quell the rebellion. But for 4 bloody months, even as food ran out, the rebels managed to hold off the government attacks. The shogun was so incensed at the continuing rebellion that he asked the Dutch to send a ship with cannons against the besieged castle.
The Dutch were reluctant to take part in this campaign, but nevertheless they desperately wanted to hold on to this toehold which they had in trade with Japan. And so if they didn't obey the order of the shogun, he might well say, well, okay, you can pack up and go home.
The shogun ordered the castle set ablaze. Still, the rebels fought back. But in the end, their fate was sealed.
And the castle fell finally through starvation. And then followed a dreadful slaughter. that was the last battle, really, in Japanese history.
The Shimabara Rebellion was the excuse the shogun needed to finally eradicate Christianity from Japan.
The shogun decided draconian measures. We will cut off Japan from all Christian influence. Now, how can you do that? We will isolate Japan. These foreigners, of course, so much trouble, I suppose he was thinking. They are an unnecessary complication to our life. So why not try to preserve Japanese society as is now? We don't want changes.
The third shogun issued laws restricting travel outside of the country. On penalty of death, no Japanese could leave Japan, and those who were already abroad could not return. To ensure his edicts were obeyed, he destroyed all ships of seagoing capacity. Then he forbade the entry of any ship of European origin. Only the Dutch were allowed to stay and trade, but with severe restrictions.
The maritime restrictions are designed to prevent any unauthorized contact with the outside world. They're designed to control trade, and they're designed to prevent Christian missionaries from reaching Japan and being able to proselytize. And they form the bedrock of Tokugawa foreign policy for the life of the shogunate, which is sometimes called the beginning of the isolation of Japan.
2 years later, in defiance of the shogun's ban, an official Portuguese trade delegation arrived in Japan. The shogun showed no mercy and ordered the execution of 57 of those aboard, ambassadors and their crew. He ordered the ship burned. The few survivors were sent back with this warning.
A similar penalty will be suffered by all who come to these shores from Portugal, whether they be ambassadors or sailors, whether they come by error or driven by storm. Even more, if the King of Portugal or even the God of the Christians were to come, they would all pay the very same penalty.
The doors of Japan clanged shut and were not opened again to the West for 200 years. The will of the shogun had prevailed. But many wondered how this isolated empire would survive in a rapidly changing world.